All right, y'all, I'm back, and we're going to take kind of that encouragement from the first video, the initial video that kind of set the stage for kind of what are we going to kind of do equipping-wise, encouragement-wise during the lockdown. And I kind of brought up three things. I talked about engaging the mind, I talked about engaging the body, and I talked about engaging the soul. So this is going to be the first video in a series on engaging the mind. All right, and I'm going to talk about the Bible, all right, and I'm talking about books of the Bible that are helpful for a beginner to read, an intermediate kind of younger person to read, and then books of the Bible that are a little bit more challenging to read. And what I mean by challenging in these levels is not necessarily the theology. The Bible is always challenging in theology, but I'm talking about more just casual reading, understanding, in reading through the scriptures, and the beginner levels are more easy to just track along, even though the theological points are very challenging at times. So it's more of just the readability, and just conceptually, it's easier to discern kind of how the book fits together, okay? So that's kind of what I mean by beginner, intermediate, and advanced for Bible books, okay, of which I'm going to recommend one from the Old Testament and one from the New Testament, though actually two from the New Testament in the advanced level. And I'm also going to recommend having a good study Bible, okay? For some of you, I know that for most of us didn't grow up in a Presbyterian tradition, but this is not just Presbyterian, this is just kind of general as Christians today. We don't carry our Bibles around much anymore because of how digital the world is. And that's okay. We're not trying to condemn that, but what we need to do is to make sure that we have a plan for having a Bible and how we use one, right? So I'm also going to recommend 3 ways to read the Bible as well. And my favorite Bible is the study Bible called the Reformation Study Bible. And this is the one done by R.C. Sproul's ministry, who's since passed, called the Reformation Study Bible. And everyone needs to have a study Bible, okay? And this is a good one because it has about 100 plus short articles on books of the Bible, gives you some short overviews about what the book's about. It also gives you some understanding of different concepts and points of theology about what does this stuff mean to my life, what does it mean about who God is and how he works. And so that'll be very helpful. And then the notes at the bottom are helpful, but they're not congested, okay? So they don't overwhelm or start to get lost they're not commentaries, okay? So it's very good study Bible, and I would recommend you to have at least one. If it's not this one, you need to have another one that's study Bible, and they're kind of the fad right now, and you can find really good ones anywhere. But students, you need to have one, especially senior high students. You need to be having a study Bible so you can learn to read the Bible well, okay? So my recommendations for books of the Bible, and then I'm going to give you some ways to read the Bible as you have some extra time on your hands. I'm going to be drinking my coffee while we're doing this. I have to have inspiration. Okay. So the first for beginner books would be the book of Genesis from the Old Testament, which means beginnings. That's what Genesis means. It means beginnings. And then for the New Testament, I would recommend the book of John. It's the Gospel according to St. John. And both very challenging in some of their theology, meaning the creation narrative of Genesis 1-3, the incarnation of John chapter 1, the high priestly prayer in John 17, the ideas that are being taught about Jesus being the bread of life and the door and the great shepherd. These are challenging theological things, but they're easy to discern in how they fit into the story through just casual reading. So I would encourage in Genesis, students read through all 50 chapters in a week. Or if you're super ambitious to read the whole thing in one day. It's 50 chapters, but it makes sense. So the way the book breaks down is you have kind of what we would call prehistory, okay? God creating the world, all right, in Genesis 1-3. The fall, which is a theological term that means man's apostasy from God's will. Basically us turning our backs on God. And then the fallout is what happens after that in my term. It's the fallout. So it's the fall and it's the fallout. And the fallout between Genesis kind of 4 through Genesis 11. And then we start to see God's rescue plan in history, though he's always had a rescue plan from eternity. but we start to see his rescue plan played out starting in Genesis chapter 12 with Abraham, and then it follows the lineage of Abraham and his sons, we call the patriarchs, okay, of our faith. So it goes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and then Joseph. And chapter 50 ends with the death of Joseph in Egypt, okay? And so the book of Genesis is very easy to follow. It's prehistory, creation, fall, the fallout, and then the patriarchs and God's rescue plan from Genesis 12 through Genesis 50. Very engaging book. In fact, I just used to think when I was a younger kid that these Old Testament books were boring. And I didn't read them because I just immediately thought they're boring. They're going to be boring books. They actually have a lot more action and drama than a lot of the New Testament books do. There's a lot going on, and they're fascinating to read. In fact, I am reading through Deuteronomy right now. I'm like, this is a fascinating book. And I'm reading through 1st and 2nd Samuel. I've read through 1st and 2nd Samuel so many times, and it's good every time. And then in the New Testament, we're reading the Gospel of Mark. And so there's a lot of action-packed kind of drama in these books, and I would encourage you, if you like drama and you like intrigue and you like kind of understanding how the Bible unfolds, you need to read the book of Genesis. As for the book of John is really the bookend. It's on the other side of Genesis. It starts in the same way. And the book of Genesis is how God creates the world, but it's in the beginning, God creates the world through the Son. And we see a parallel with Genesis 1 and John chapter 1 there. And then the heart of God, the very heart of God, the Son of God who's been in the bosom of the Father, John 1:18, discloses him to us. And really, the book of John is talking about the divinity of Jesus, that he is the Son of God from heaven. And so it takes kind of what we call the high approach of Jesus, of heaven coming down, whereas the first three Gospels are more of Jesus as a human being, revealing he is the Son of Man, who is the Son of God. The book of John is revealing from the very beginning, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. He's the Son of God, and he's come to disclose the heart of God in heaven. So those are two great beginner level books. I'll be a little bit quicker on the intermediate level books. Intermediate level books are books that are a little bit more challenging to read just when it comes to the concepts or the history. 1st and 2nd Samuel are my favorite of the history books of Old Testament because of the way it shows the life of David. Okay, now Chronicles does the same thing, but it's basically going from Samuel to David and David's ministry and David's fall and then recovery and God's promise of the covenant and things like this. These books are just incredible. Really kind of like probably a 6-episode streaming event, a limited series on Netflix would be awesome for 1st and 2nd Samuel. So I'd encourage you to read that as a group, okay? They're meant to be read together. In fact, the Protestant tradition breaks them up into 2 books, and the other traditions that we come from don't break them up. It keeps them all together, which sometimes would be better if we just learn to keep them all together. But 1st and 2nd Samuel. And then as for the New Testament, very short book, only 6 chapters. A little bit harder to read because the concepts in them are a little bit more challenging. But the book of Ephesians, it's an epistle, it's a letter, and this is a universal letter, meaning it was not necessarily written directly to one church, though it did have a destination. Ephesus is where Paul wrote the book, okay? And he wrote it to the Ephesians, right? But at the same time, it was a circulated book, a book that was universal in scope. It was really a book meant for all Christians. Now, every book is meant for all Christians, but in the original intention of the author, this was a book that was meant to be disseminated everywhere. So it has a little bit of a bigger, wider, broader scope. And so the plan of God is disclosed in the book of Ephesians, and it is like, whoa. And so the concepts of this book are a little bit more challenging, like the mystery of God being unveiled in Ephesians 3, or praying that people would grow in the ministry of discernment and revelation, chapter 1. I mean, what does that even mean? There's some hard things that he's kind of talking about there, but yet there's some familiar stuff. Ephesians chapter 2, 1 through 10 is well-known, well-preached passage that you'll recognize about the condition of people before God's grace intervenes, and what God's grace does, it changes people, is what Ephesians 2 talks about. And then Ephesians 4 and 5 and 6 get into practical living. In fact, the awakening which is what I call our Sunday night youth service, comes from Ephesians 5:14. It says, "Awake, O sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine light upon you." Apostle Paul is quoting a hymn that they sung at that time in that passage, and that's why I take the phrase "the awakening" from. It's meant for Christians. It's not a revival necessarily, which is for non-believers, but awakening is for believers to be reawakened to God's purpose and God's nature. Okay, so Ephesians, easy to read in one setting. I used to read it almost weekly when I was in high school on the way to school. I would read it in a couple morning drives with my dad, and it's a very quick read, and I started becoming more familiar with the book. The last challenging books I would tell you to read from the Bible are three. I'm going to give you two recommendations from the New Testament. The first one from the Old Testament is the book of Deuteronomy. This one's challenging because it's a second telling of the covenant. Before they go into the land of Canaan, Moses reminds them everything that God's covenant entails. Basically, in a way, this is probably not the best word to use, but it's a recommitment in some sense. It's a retelling. It's a reinstitution. It's a reminding, okay? This is the relationship and the arrangement between God and his people, Israel. Don't follow the idols of Canaan, the land they're going into. Remember what I told you. Remember who you are. And so there's a lot of that in Deuteronomy. The 10 Commandments are there again. They show up again earlier on this time. And as you go through, you're starting to, the cities of refuge from Exodus get told again in the book of Deuteronomy. And then all the stipulations of God's covenant through Moses are told again in kind of a fresh way. So a little bit more of a challenging book because you gotta have to know the Old Testament and the first 4 books a little bit before you read that book. But that's an advanced book, and it's a longer book. I think it's 34 chapters if I remember. So a little bit longer of a book. And then for the New Testament, a short one and a long one. Okay, short book sometimes can be deceptive and difficulty. I would say 1 John is a challenging book, not because of how long it is. It's only 5 chapters, but because of the challenge of the content of the book. It's saying fellowship with God looks like this, this, and this. It doesn't look like this, this, or this. And when you start to read it, you're going to be convicted. We're going to be convicted. It's a challenging book. It says if we know Jesus, we will walk like Jesus. If we say we know Jesus, we will love the brethren. It says in 1 John 2, 5, and 6. It's challenging stuff. And then it says, if we say we know God, but we walk in the darkness, we're a hypocrite. 1 John 1, 8. So there's some challenging stuff in that book that's hard for us when we really read it and we're reading it in the right way. So I would say it's not long, but the concepts of what it means to have fellowship with God, they're challenging in 1 John. The other book that's very hard, I would say, is the book of Romans. As St. Peter says, some things that Paul says are perplexing. We have no clue what he's talking about half the time. That's my paraphrase of what Peter says in 1 Peter. But they're hard. They're hard things. The doctrine of election, the doctrine of imputation, what it means to be a living sacrifice and being conformed to God's will through being transformed by the renewing of your mind. I mean, everyone says stuff like that, but what does that even mean? These are hard things. It talks about the gifts of the Spirit in Romans 12. It talks about how we're supposed to respect the authorities that God gives us in the government. Romans 13. That's something that's really important right now, given the pandemic that's going around and churches needing to follow the civil authorities. And then it gets into some other helpful encouragements in Romans 14 about the conscience, and 15 and 16 as well. But the book is challenging because of its length. It's 16 chapters, because of its content, and because of the foreignness of the theology. So students, you might get some of it, but it's a tightly woven, tightly wound argument. Doesn't mean you should shy away from reading Romans, okay? I would encourage you on a reading plan of a hard book like Deuteronomy or Romans or John to do it in small chunks, okay? Because if not, it's just going to go right by you, okay? So Deuteronomy, maybe 3 chapters at a time. John, maybe just 1 chapter. In fact, you could do a couple books, but just do 1 chapter a piece. That's what I do a lot. And then Romans, 1 chapter, okay? 1 chapter a day, all right? So you can really think through it as you read, all right? So beginner books, Genesis would be great. Gospel of John. Intermediate books, 1st and 2nd Samuel, kind of as a tag team there. The book of Ephesians, which is only 6 chapters long. But then advanced books have to have some content already built up in your head, knowing what you're kind of reading a little bit before you get into it. Deuteronomy is really one of the best books of the Old Testament. In fact, it's a book that Jesus quotes repeatedly. Jesus loves to quote from Deuteronomy, the Psalms, a ton, especially in Isaiah. Jesus quotes a lot from those books, okay? So probably should be good for us to know them. And then in the New Testament, the book of 1 John and the book of Romans, both letters written by apostles and challenging in content, though not as long as the Old Testament books. And then I'm going to finish by encouraging you all that there are 3 ways you can read the Bible, okay? This is kind of student level, okay? And I'm going to tell you the most profitable way to read the Bible. But the other ways are not wrong, and there's a use for them in some ways, okay? The first way to read the Bible is informationally, okay? You're just trying to understand what it says, okay? The Gospel of Mark. What is the Gospel of Mark about? In the first 5 chapters, Jesus is casting out, exhorting demons all over the place. It's good for me to know that, okay? The Gospel of Mark is about Jesus' ministry to Gentiles, okay? And the book is for non-Jewish people. So it's supposed to be capturing kind of the gist of what Jesus' ministry was and who he is. So it's a faster paced kind of snapshot of his ministry. It would be good to know that. That's an informational reading of Mark, okay? Informational reading books are helpful because you have to know the content to believe in it, okay? You have to know the content to know how they relate to other content in the Bible, all right? So informational, people kind of, hate on this a lot. That's just reading it for info, or God didn't give us information just for, that's true. But information's still a piece of it, and we need to learn that content is helpful. So the first thing is you do need to read the Bible with some informational desire, okay, to learn it, the content of what's in it, okay? The second thing is you need to learn to eventually start to study it. Now, given that if you're brand new to the Bible, studying the Bible is probably not what you need to be doing, okay? In the sense of you're meditating, you're kind of thinking through it, and you're kind of learning how the pieces fit together, okay? So if you've read the Bible a lot in your life, you've read through the Bible before in your life, you need to be at this level at least by now. Learning to study the Bible as you read it, not just read through it just straight through for content, okay? And so reading the Bible with a steady mindset would be like when you read John 7 and he says that I'm the river of life. You'd be like, I wonder where that river of life thing Jesus is talking about. And you're going to realize that's in Ezekiel. And then also you're going to realize, oh, that's what Revelation 21 and 22 are talking about, this river of life. And so you start to study the relationships between the content of the Bible, book to book, and within the book itself, okay? When Jesus says, I am the door, right? Or I'm the great shepherd. What psalm is he talking about there, right? For sure, the great shepherd is Psalm 23, right? And many others, right? And the idea of the door is from the book of Leviticus, and how sacrifices through the temple were only through one door. So this idea of studying the Bible, not just to inform yourself of what's in it, but knowing the relationships in it, okay? So that's studying the Bible. The last one is the most mature, okay? And this is not for beginners, all right? And doesn't mean that you can't try it, okay? But the goal, ultimately, of the Bible is to change us and to change the world. So I would call this method prayerful reading of the Bible, okay? So when I read the scriptures, this is kind of how I do it. I encourage you, is I select a psalm to read, I select an Old Testament chapter to read, I select a New Testament chapter to read, and I try to stick with the same books. And I will do it every couple of days. I try my best to stick with it, okay? And then after I read it, I meditate upon it. I think about what I've read, and then I think about how God would want me to enact that in my own life and how it relates to me in my own life in 2020. And what in my own heart is displeasing to God, and what in my life needs to be esteemed that God is working in my life. How might I continue to grow as a disciple of Jesus? And so I think about how I can prayerfully respond to what I read. So it's not just content, it's not just studying the Bible for studying's sake and learning how it fits. It's also saying, how does this fit into my life, and how does my life fit into the scripture? And how do we kind of have a marriage together in the way that we read the scriptures? That's a mature way. Does not mean that you can't do it, but that's where we want to ultimately point it to. Okay, so that is engaging the mind, the Bible, beginner, intermediate, advanced books of recommendation for you all to read, and then also some really good ways to go about reading the content, the information, studying, and being prayerful with it, okay? So I'm going to do another video here in a little bit for you as well, and I'll be recommending some other books to go alongside the scriptures to support you in your reading and study.